Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Kolbersh and I am with the ISPE Boston area chapter. It is now 12 p.m. and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Baseline Guide Volume 5, The Path to Revision and How to Apply It. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You are listening to this event using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select Phone Call in the audio pane and dial-in information will be displayed. All attendees will be muted by default. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the question pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If we don't get to every question by 1 p.m., we will follow up with an answer by email. I would now like to introduce Chip Bennett, Assistant Director of Global C&Q with CAI.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending today's webinar. And let me bring up the presentation mode. All right. So today we're going to be talking about Baseline Guide Volume 5, the revised version that came out last year. High-level agenda, I want to talk about what led to the original Baseline Guide, what led from that guide to the revision, some of the differences between the two editions, and then how to apply the concepts in that guide to your C&Q processes. So just a quick note, I'm not a member of the Community of Practice Steering Committee or an author of the guide. There is an official Community of Practice presentation. This one isn't it. I take a little bit different approach. Rather than just talk about the content of the revised guide, I want to talk a little bit about the historical context and evolution between the guides and some of the practical implementation based on project experience implementing the approach in the guide. So where were we back in 2001 when the original Baseline Guide was published? So if you've been in the industry for a while, you're probably very familiar with the old V-model approach to validation. And at that time, some of the industry drivers to publishing a guidance document were the delivery cost, schedule, and effectiveness of the V-model approach. And it included a lot of duplicated effort, which increased cost, extended schedules, and really could benefit from being more effective. In general, in the industry, there was inconsistent commissioning qualification terminology and inconsistent interpretation of CGMP requirements. So similarly, regulators had some of the same drivers. The agency wanted to align with industry regarding expectations for commissioning qualification, wanted the industry and inspectors to have a consistent terminology and approach to C&Q, and they wanted to focus the effort on product quality and risk to product quality. So the original Baseline Guide was published, and you may hopefully recognize this commissioning and qualification, or C&Q approach. There were some problems, or I should say shortcomings, in incorporating quality risk management into this process. This process was always intended to be a risk-based approach, but from the perspective of what we understand now with quality risk management, product and process knowledge, meaning critical quality attributes and critical process parameters, were not really understood or documented explicitly through this process. If you're familiar with the system level impact assessment and component criticality assessment, this part of this process, it was really a bottom-up approach to risk assessment, looking primarily at the equipment systems rather than at the quality attributes of the product. So, and the outcome was very binary. You'd have yes and no questions that led to an is or is not decision. System would be direct, indirect, or no impact. A component would be critical or not critical, which is very binary. As such, risk to product quality was really not well identified, assessed, or controlled. And therefore, even though the testing plan where differentiating between commissioning and qualification was based on those assessments. Other than that very binary differentiation, testing was not really demonstrably commensurate with risk. Additionally, engineering and quality roles and responsibilities were very siloed in this process, often overlap and even seen to be contradictory. If you talk about the leveraging approach of leveraging commissioning into qualification caused a lot of that overlap and contradiction. And as a result, the approach was more inefficient than it was intended to be. It led to prescriptive testing strategy. It kind of kept the test everything mentality from the V model. And then the overlap between engineering and qualification led to non-value added testing redundancy. So from 2001 until today, what are some of the business drivers for revising the baseline guide? Speed to market and startup cost are two of the biggest drivers. What you see here is sort of a typical project startup experience. At the top, you have a very long startup time. You have a goal of operational efficiency that you never really reach. And then at the bottom, you see kind of the progress of experiencing and resolving problems throughout the process. Problems increase through startup, lead to some of that long startup time, start to get resolved. As soon as you go into manufacturing, you start experiencing more problems. As a result, you never reach the optimum efficiency in your operation. So this is the ideal state where problems are identified early in the process, even before startup. The problems are mitigated. Thus, your startup time is reduced and you quickly reach your optimal efficiency goal. What about regulators? Regulators, in the intervening time from then to now, have expressed a great interest in quality risk management. And this is sort of an outline of industry and regulator guidances that have been developed between the two versions of the baseline guide. And I'd like to look at a few of those by the regulators, particularly the 21st Century Initiative published by FDA, and then a process validation guidance for industry, and EU Annex 15. So what do they have to say about quality risk management? In the 21st Century Initiative document, FDA focused on innovation, implementation of quality risk management and quality systems, applying risk-based approaches, critical areas, and applying state-of-the-art science. Similarly, in the process validation guidance, most of the same concepts. Additionally, understanding criticality as a continuum, applying control that's commensurate with risk, and having less reliance on terminology. And again, similarly, in Annex 15, the EU emphasized control of critical aspects of systems, applying quality risk management and risk assessment as the basis and justification for qualification and validation. So very clear message from the regulators for where they wanted to see the industry go. So the industry responded. Several documents developed during this period. ICHQ8, pharmaceutical development, introduced and defined the concepts of critical quality attributes, critical process parameters, and quality by design principles. ISPE published a white paper that really was the precursor to the later ASTM E2500 document that introduced principles of risk-based verification. ICHQ9 defined quality risk management. And then a very important document through this progress is E2500. It was really the first definition of a risk-based verification process as applied to facility systems and equipment. And then ICHQ10 defined the concept of a control strategy. And as a result, ISPE published two guidance documents, which is the industry's first attempt at applying all of this understanding of quality risk management. The first one was the FSE guide, which is basically a full implementation of E2500, and then the applied risk management guide was sort of a bridge document, right, how to go from where you are now a little further down the road towards applying quality risk management principles. And in that time, we've seen some real improvement. This is and indexed benchmarking data from several of our projects, where we look at the amount of execution labor required based on the approach to commissioning qualification. As you can see, as you move from a V model to a C&Q model to a QRM-based integrated approach, the amount of labor does go down. We do see efficiency gains. And as you can see across the industry slowly moved to adopt QRM-based approaches. But as you can see, that we never really improved much from that number in the around 2013, 2014. So as a result, the industry decided that we really needed to update the baseline guide itself to define an industry standard consistent process that implements QRM principles. So last year, the revised baseline guide was published that does exactly that. So what's changed between the two guides? Primarily, the revised baseline guide incorporates quality risk management principles. It is a science and risk-based approach to commissioning qualification. It focuses on quality by design, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get into some of the process and deliverables. It incorporates all of those industry standards, all the ICH guidances, ASTM E2500, et cetera, and provides some other benefits as well. It's a consistent compliant approach to a QRM-based C&Q process. As the industry tried to incorporate those practices, the principles based on E2500, there are many ways to skin a cat, so to speak. This provides a single approach that the industry has now said, this is our consistent approach that's compliant with the principles. It's considerably more efficient than the legacy C&Q approach, and it incorporates a risk-based life cycle approach. The earlier version of the baseline guide really spoke less to life cycle approach and more to delivery of C&Q, and the revised guide is very much a life cycle approach. The new guide defines and retires several terms. So let's look at the terms that it explicitly defines. And these are terms that throughout the industry, from one company to another, could have different definitions. So commissioning and qualification, validation and verification. I will not read all of these to you word for word. You'll have the slides afterwards if you want to read each of them, but I do want to point out commissioning and qualification per the baseline guide are processes. Commissioning is an engineering process and approach. Qualification is a quality process. The purpose of the commissioning process is to deliver systems fit for purpose, and the purpose of the qualification process is to document and verify that critical systems are fit for purpose. The baseline guide describes an approach that integrates these two processes, which is a very important point, as I'll come to in a minute. Validation is the standard definition of validation. Verification is an activity within the integrated C&Q process that documents fitness for purpose. So essentially, it's any testing or documentation activity within a C&Q process. And finally, the revised guide introduces a new term, critical design element, and I will explain how that fits into the application of the QRM principles momentarily. So the terms that are retired, indirect impact is no longer a concept. The revised guide uses a system classification that replaces the old system level impact assessment and component criticality assessment. And in that classification, systems are either direct impact or not direct impact. Thus, the component criticality assessment itself has been deprecated entirely in place of a more formal system risk assessment. The concept of V model as an approach to validation has been formally retired. In response to the implementation of the legacy C&Q approach, the concept of enhanced documentation or commissioning or design review have been retired. All of those activities per the revised baseline guides should be done under the auspices of good engineering practice, and they should be appropriately documented and have appropriate rigor for their purpose. And finally, the concept of leveraging is formally retired in the revised baseline guide. So what does the process look like? This is the C&Q process that's described in the revised guide. If you're familiar with E2500, it's not considerably different. If you're familiar with a legacy C&Q approach, it's not considerably different. What's really changed is how you progress through this process and kind of the roles of engineering and quality through the process. So what do those look like? In the integrated C&Q process, engineering's role is system delivery, and the quality unit's role is ensuring product quality. Thus, the focus of engineering is system fitness for use. The quality unit focuses on understanding and verifying product and process knowledge, the risk control strategy, and ensuring that system design and verification of critical aspects meet the critical requirements of the system. Therefore, the responsibility of engineering is verification. That is, the testing and documentation is the responsibility of engineering, and quality then takes an oversight or approval role. And I'll explain how those work together. So this diagram really shows the responsibility and quality touchpoints as you proceed through the process. Probably the biggest changes here are that the importance of the process development phase as an input to the C&Q process. Understanding critical quality attributes and critical process parameters is a requirement for proper implementation of integrated commissioning and qualification. Additionally, if you look at the verification testing, it is almost entirely under the purview of appropriate subject matter experts following good engineering practice. So that means engineering typically is responsible for development, execution, review, and approval of all the verification testing. There's some overlap there. What we understand as PQs, so say a load configuration PQ for an autoclave, obviously that would still be pre and post approved by quality. But what we currently understand as IOQ, the testing that supports IOQ, per this process falls entirely under engineering. And this is straight out of the guide that shows the approval responsibilities based on deliverable type. And again, you can look at this in more detail in the guide or in the presentation slides afterward. But just wanted to reiterate, as you see the commissioning testing, the testing that supports the commissioning process is not reviewed or approved pre or post by the quality unit. So I've talked a bit about applying quality risk management to the integrated C&Q process. Let's look a little bit at what that means. This is the quality risk management flow diagram defined in ICH Q9. And I think we're all pretty well comfortable with this part, the risk assessment part. Unfortunately, we haven't done much with that. Once we've done a risk assessment, some are done better than others. Some are done as a checkbox activity and put on a shelf. But the real meat of a risk assessment is what you do with it, and that's this part of the diagram. It's important that we not just assess risks, but then we apply risk control to mitigate those risks and use that to define our strategy and rationale for our integrated commissioning and qualification process. So quality risk management is a holistic life cycle process for systems. And again, it begins with process development, where product and process knowledge is defined. CQAs and CPPs are an output of process development and an input to the C&Q process. And we begin with risk assessment, where we identify risks to product quality posed by the process. We then apply risk control, which means that we identify critical aspects, which are the means of mitigating the risks that we've identified. We then perform risk review, which in this stage of the C&Q process is done through design review. The design is reviewed against the user requirements, and the risk assessment and we identify the critical design elements, which are the design features that implement the critical aspects, satisfy the critical aspects. And therefore, identifying the critical design elements and the critical aspects, we have defined our risk control strategy. We can then document that we've implemented quality by design principles, which is that the design of our risk controls, our critical aspects and the critical design elements, acceptably mitigates risk to product quality posed by the process. We then have our C&Q strategy, which is to verify installation and operation of the critical design elements, ensure they satisfy their critical aspects, and we can also demonstrate that testing rigor is commensurate not only with risk to product quality, but to degree of mitigation of that risk. And finally, in the life cycle of the systems, we then continue to use the QRM process and the information developed through it during periodic review and revalidation. We can review the process performance with respect to critical process parameters and critical quality attributes. We can use continuous improvement to identify design changes that can improve performance of CQAs and delivery of, of CPPs and delivery of CQAs. We can differentiate change management based on risk to product quality, allowing engineering change management to manage changes that do not impact critical aspects or critical design elements, and then in deviation and in kappa management as well. If we know that a failure in a CPP in one system requires a certain preventive action, that makes it very easy to identify where that same critical aspect exists in another system that would potentially benefit from applying that same protective preventive action for the CPPs of that process. So how do we apply QRM concepts to commissioning and qualification? Again, we start with critical quality attributes. CQAs apply to the product. We identify them through product and process knowledge as part of process development. And we can define a risk to product quality as a failure to meet a CQA. We then look at critical process parameters, which apply to the process. They are also identified as part of product and process knowledge through process development and may be refined through our risk assessment. We define a process risk as a failure to maintain a CPP. We then identify critical aspects through the risk control process. Critical aspects apply to process systems such as equipment or utility or the facility itself. And it originates from risk assessment, and we define our risk control strategy as critical aspects collectively mitigate unacceptable risk to product quality. And then through design, we identify critical design elements. They apply to a process system design element, a component, a process control, alarm, could be a procedural control, etc. And they originate from critical aspects and design review. From there, we can define our verification strategy as critical design elements being tested to verify that their installation and operation are fit for intended use. So let's look a little bit more at the relationship between CQA, CPP, critical aspect, and critical design element. So we'll start with a simple process. It's a mixing process that has a tank and an agitator. Our product and process knowledge tell us that our critical quality attribute is potency, and therefore critical process parameters are mixing speed and mixing time. We then perform risk assessment, and we identify failure modes for those critical process parameters. So failure to control mixing speed or failure to control mixing time would lead to the same CQA impact, which is incorrect potency. We then apply risk control and identify critical aspects, which are the control, monitoring, and alarming of mixing speed and mixing time. Then we review the design and identify the critical design elements that implement those critical aspects, being the agitator speed controller, speed indicator, speed alarm sensor, and a timer, time indicator, and alarm sensor. So how do we apply those principles to the C&Q process deliverables? I'm going to step through a simplified example based on the key deliverables of the process. And we'll start with the user requirement specification. So I'm going to step through a different system through each of the steps that we just went through, and I'm going to introduce the appropriate deliverable as we go through the process. So this time we're going to look at a Wi-Fi storage tank that's part of Wi-Fi generation, distribution, and storage. Our CQA here is the water meter specification for Wi-Fi USP. And our critical process parameters are that product contact surfaces are non-additive, non-reactive, non-absorptive, drainability, and cleanability. Now, certainly there are many other CPPs, many other CQAs that you could look at, but for the purposes of this example, I'm just going to look at these three. So here's a user requirement specification. Shouldn't be much different from any URS that you may have seen. In this case, the first section of the user requirement specification explicitly calls out CQAs and CPPs. And then for all other requirements, we type them based on their product quality impact. So user requirement may be business related or environmental health and safety related. It may be a quality requirement from company quality requirements or a general regulatory requirement. But by typing it this way, we differentiate between those user requirements that do potentially impact product quality and those that are not expected to impact product quality. Then we perform risk assessment. So looking at our example again, we identify our failure modes as a material of construction being additive, reactive, or absorptive, and the CQA impact there is a chemical failure, such as TOC or conductivity or pH. If the vessel is not drainable, the CQA impact would be microbial failures, such as bioburden or endotoxin, or if the vessel is not cleanable, the CQA impact could be a chemical or a microbial failure. So we apply risk controls. We identify critical aspects as being the design of the materials of construction, hygienic vessel design, and design and control of cleaning and spray ball coverage of the vessel. So that risk assessment then looks a little bit like this. And as you can see, the CQAs and CPPs are inputs to the risk assessment. Then we identify the process risks to CQAs. Again, those are the failure to control our CPPs. And then from there, we identify the design controls, recipe parameters, alarms, procedural controls, etc., that mitigate the risks that we've identified. And again, all of those risk mitigations are our critical aspects. We then implement a project tool, being the requirements traceability matrix, which looks something like this. And as you can see, we're tracing the user requirements to the risk assessment that we performed. We identify the critical aspects or risk controls, ensure that they trace to CQAs and CPPs or to the other quality requirements that we identified. Then as we have our design, which is an iterative process, we perform design review and we identify our critical design elements. So in this case, our critical design elements are 316L stainless steel vessel material of construction, a conical vessel bottom, and a spray ball control and monitoring of CIP supply flow. And this is trace matrix as the means of performing design review. Obviously, design review does not have to be done in this manner, but this is one approach. You directly trace the URS to the design. And we can see that our critical design elements trace to our CQAs and our CPPs. We then, once we have a final approved design, from that final trace matrix that traces the design to the URS, we can extract the data that we need for design qualification, which looks pretty much like this. As you can see, we're documenting that the design has satisfied the quality user requirements. We're documenting that the design of critical design elements satisfies critical aspects. And we document our risk control strategy being the collective identification of critical aspects and the critical design elements that satisfy them. Through this, we document quality by design. We document that critical quality attributes and critical process parameters that base risk controls have been incorporated into the design, and that critical aspects acceptably mitigate risk to product quality. So with both of those, we have demonstrated we've applied quality by design principles. We then can develop our C&Q plan, which uses the output of design qualification, which is essentially all the critical aspects, critical design elements, their specifications, and apply that directly as our approach to commissioning qualification to ensure that our testing is commensurate with risk. And then I'm not going to get into too much detail on the specifics of the plan or of the testing, other than to point out that an efficient approach to delivery of C&Q would drive as much of the testing as early in the process as possible. So it is advantageous to make use of any factory acceptance testing that's being performed, any other vendor documentation as part of startup and engineering commissioning, site acceptance testing, etc. All of those are suitable when documented properly and executed properly to contribute as verification activities as defined by the guide. And then we can use our RTM tool to trace the results of that testing back to our user requirements. So this is the same trace matrix looking at user requirements and the verification testing that challenged and documented them. So as you can see, verification testing traces back to CQAs and CPPs, and we can show by documenting the results that the testing met specification. And finally, we have acceptance and release. And this acceptance and release report is the same information that's in the trace matrix. In this case, we're documenting verification that system meets specification for quality user requirements, and that the system satisfies its critical aspects. And as a result, we've documented that installation and operation of critical design elements are fit for intended use. So what are some of the benefits and opportunities from applying the revised baseline guide? So I want to look at several processes in the legacy C&Q approach, look at what's changed in the revised guide, and then describe the benefits. So if we look at C&Q testing, the historical approach is that qualification protocols are developed and executed at project end with testing that's redundant to the engineering lifecycle. So the revised baseline guide applies robust and mature good engineering practices. As a result, the qualification process is integrated into the engineering project without introduction of non-value-added redundant testing. As a benefit, this approach is an efficient use of resources, and it reduces pressure on the project schedule. As I'm sure everyone who is involved in validation knows, schedule compression always leads to a lot of stress for the validation team and phase of the project. This approach helps minimize that schedule pressure while also eliminating non-value-added redundant testing. If we look at requirements definition, the historical approach is that qualification testing is based on equipment specifications and capabilities. That is testing to the engineering and manufacturing specs rather than testing to what the user actually requires. The revised baseline guide applies quality risk management. As a result, the testing considers the controls, detection mechanisms, and all quality systems. Again, the testing is directly tied to identification of and specification of the critical design elements that satisfy the risk control means, which are the critical aspects of the system. As a result, it focuses the qualification effort on defined critical aspects. If we look at the design process, the historical approach is that design review has been applied inconsistently and with unstructured quality involvement, which could be more or less quality involvement, inconsistent quality involvement, etc. The revised baseline guide applies systematic design review as a mature, good engineering practice system. And as a result, design review is well directed and has defined quality involvement. The benefit is that it enables an appropriate and defendable quality oversight through the design review process. Because again, it focuses quality on identifying the critical design elements that satisfy critical aspects and ensuring that the design acceptably mitigates risk to product quality. If we look at change management, the historical approach has been that changes throughout the project delivery are not well controlled until a system is qualified and released for use. The age-old argument of does change control apply at the start of IQ, at the end of IQ, at the end of OQ? The revised baseline guide applies engineering change management, again, as a robust, good engineering practice process. As a result, all changes are effectively managed throughout the engineering project under the auspices of engineering change management. The benefit is that it prevents the need to perform redundant testing at project end because changes have not been well managed, well documented, with any impact to critical aspects assessed and addressed. So additionally, QRM can be applied throughout the system lifecycle. So what that looks like specifically, again, through periodic review and revalidation, you can identify any risks to product quality that have occurred through the processing and use that as an input to the QRM process risk assessment, identify any additional risk controls that may be needed. Similarly, continuous improvement can focus on the documented impact to the process on delivering critical quality attributes. Change management can continue to be differentiated between engineering change management and quality change control based on impact to critical aspects, and deviation and kappa management can use product and process knowledge to better ensure effectiveness of kappas. And that is the content of what I wanted to present today, and I would love to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Chip. We are now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the question pane in your attendee control panel. All right, so our first question is, what is the regulatory position on the approach described in the revised baseline guide?
That's a very interesting question. And regulators were involved in the development of the revised baseline guide. And as you would expect, based on where regulators have been pushing the industry over the last almost 20 years, there is an expectation that firms will incorporate quality risk management into their C&Q approach. And in fact, during development of the guide, there's a flowchart, process flowchart in the guide, and the initial decision point was, will you implement QRM into C&Q, yes or no? And a regulator response to that flowchart was, that's the incorrect starting point. We expect that starting point to be the assumption that QRM will be used. So that question should be, will you apply the QRM-based process defined by this guide, yes or no? If yes, you follow the guide. If no, then you need to define your own approach that implements quality risk management principles.
Okay, so it looks like we have a second question as well. That second question would be, how can this approach be incorporated into legacy facilities and systems?
So that's another challenge. So it's a good question. Um, so I would typically start with um, kind of known quantity systems. I think this approach is really easy to apply to systems where we may not have CQAs and CPPs well documented, but we understand them, and it'd be very easy to document them. So take aseptic fill finish, for example. Uh, CQAs there are basically avoiding contaminating the product, and then the CPPs are driven by very well-known standards. So that's an area that would be easy to start by documenting what your CQAs and your CPPs are, and then probably revising or developing URSs that start from that product and process knowledge, and then going through the process from there. Um, for legacy facilities in general, you probably have to look at what your existing policies and procedures are to determine whether you're going to pilot a program to qualify a new piece of equipment, a new system, or retrospectively qualify existing equipment using a new approach. And that may be developing new procedures, that might be doing the change management to do to implement a process that's outside of an existing procedure or something. You'll want to work with the quality unit to determine the path forward on that. But what is really most important with legacy facilities and systems is that you have mature, robust, well-defined, good engineering practice systems, including engineering change management, design review. The baseline guide defines an engineering quality process that basically is a subset of the quality system that defines how engineering delivers critical systems, incorporating supplier management, document and drawing control, the commissioning, startup process, turnover of systems, asset management, calibration and maintenance, etc. Make sure those systems are well developed and can support their role under this model, since really those processes are the enabler and the facilitator for implementing this process.
Thanks, Chip. We have a few more questions that came in. So the next question is, how does the QRM-based approach apply to accelerating speed to market for new construction cell and gene therapy facilities?
Another great question, and I understand where that's coming from because I've seen kind of some of the expectation for speed to market, especially in the cell and gene therapy space. I know there's even an expectation for some greenfield sites that they'll go from nothing to commercialization in 12 months, which is that's really fast in our industry. This approach helps streamline and focus the effort, so you increase the efficiency and you improve the effectiveness. It also helps understand how the process is applied commensurately with where you are. So if you're doing phase 1 facility, that's going to look different than if you're doing a phase 3 or small scale commercial facility. And using this approach helps to drive what it means to be a critical aspect. So for example, for phase 1, you're primarily looking at patient safety. So all of your critical aspects are going to be around those things that ensure patient safety. You don't necessarily know what your efficacy attributes are yet for your product, and those are developed through phase 2 and into phase 3, and then this approach becomes commensurately more rigorous as you add to your product and process knowledge. And this provides a very well documented, easily defendable approach to progressing through that.
Thank you. So it looks like we also have one more question that came in. And the question is, can this be used on COTS equipment?
Absolutely. And the guide even talks a little bit about that. The process can even be simplified for commercial off-the-shelf equipment. In some cases, it's overkill to develop a standalone URS for that equipment. Um, you might go off of the instrument spec sheet, for example. You're still going to have to identify, what your CQAs and CPPs are, all right? And you may base your design review on that same spec sheet, and you still have to tie all those things together. But you may be able to do that in a simplified manner. It still leads you to identifying what's critical about that instrument or that off-the-shelf equipment that needs to be verified. So yes, the approach can definitely be applied to COTS equipment.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions coming in at the moment, but we can give it a few more minutes if anyone has any lingering questions that they would like to pose. Okay, if anybody had any unanswered questions or questions that they come up with later, please feel free to email the office and we will follow up with an answer by email. Thank you, Chip, for sharing your expertise, and thank you to everybody who joined today's webinar for your interest and support of the ISPE Boston Area Chapter Educational Programming. You will receive a follow-up email with a short survey. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. Chip's presentation is available under the handout pane and will also be posted to our web. On behalf of ISPE Boston Area Chapter and our presenter, Chip, thank you again for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.